Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, Lee, Glenn. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. It seems that Lee is frozen. Okay.
I'm
Okay.
unfrozen.
Hello. Well, so we're going to start the NIH grant writing workshop. It will be I'm just here just to make a very brief introduction. I don't know, Anuja is the one who's going to present here. Thank you very much for preparing this for us. Glenn, Lee, thank you very much, all the people from NIH that allowed this grant writing workshop to happen here. And I don't know, Anuja, if you know, but when we did the first symposium in Rio, we thought about doing the grant writing workshop there. So we discussed with Hans at that time to have this grant writing workshop. But then when we started to talk, I think maybe with Lucy, I don't recall, but she said that there were other initiatives at that time already, including in Fiocruz, to make a grant writing workshop. That's how I know that Vinicius and Lucia were already organizing one. So we just gave up because we didn't want to duplicate the initiatives. But when we planned again for this symposium, we thought it was again a good idea, especially because it was here in Belém, so we could have some opportunity for other investigators, local investigators, to participate and to have an idea of how it works, the NIH grant system. So I'd like to thank you very much, all of you, especially you, Anuja, that was very kind to come here. Unfortunately, Lee was not able to come at the last time. We missed you here very much, Lee. And so without any further delongs, please.
I'm just waiting for the presentation to come up. Okay. Great. My name is Anuja Matthew. I'm a scientific review officer at NIAID, and I'm in the immunology review branch. Today we're going to try to do a hybrid presentation along with my colleague Glenn McGugan, and I'll ask him to introduce himself.
So hello everyone, my name is Glenn McGugan. I am a program officer at NIAID and happy to join you today. We'll try this hybrid format. Hopefully it works. Wish I could be there in person, but hopefully this works out okay.
And I'll also ask Dr. Hall to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see. Well, it's nice to see you there virtually, at least. And I'm the branch chief for the Parasitology and International Programs branch here in the Division of Microbiology and Infectious Diseases at NIAID. I'm very happy to participate in this workshop. I'm happy that we were able to put this together. And I'm very sorry that I could not be in Belém in person. But I look forward to at least hearing some of your thoughts and hearing the presentations during the workshop.
Thank you, Lee. So I'm going to spend about, Glenn and I will spend about 45 minutes giving you some background and also the history of NIAID, interaction with Brazil, and then we'll really talk about how do you generate, or how do you think about a grant and develop a grant to submit. So we want to become familiar with the organizational structure of the NIH, talk a little bit about international funding, and learn much more about the grants process, and really identify key contacts at the NIH. So a program officer like Glenn, a scientific review officer like me, and also grants management specialists, and learn to navigate through some funding opportunity and understand how funding decisions are made. So some of these slides are going to be a repeat of what Dr. Marazzo said, but I think it's worth it just to go over the slides briefly. The NIH is the largest single public funder of biomedical research in the world. We have supported over 175 Nobel Prize winners through research support. And the overall mission of the NIH is science in the pursuit of knowledge to improve health. I just wanted to make a note that we have several links and QR codes, and we've made copies of them up front. So after the presentation, please feel free to come and take some of the PDFs that we've made. It'll be helpful to you as you think about submitting an NIH application. All right. So as Dr. Marazzo said, we are not one institute, but we are 27 institutes and centers. CSR, which is the Center for Scientific Review, is the main branch that organizes the review of applications submitted to the NIH. I work at NIAID. You've heard all about NIAID in the last 3 or 4 days, at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. So in addition to the Center for Scientific Review, many of the institutes have their own review branch, and I work at the review branch at NIAID. I just wanted to touch about funding as well, and this Dr. Marazzo went over this. The overall budget for the NIH in 2022 was $45 billion. I wanted to make a point that spending at the NIH is about 15 to 17%. But most of the spending that happens off the $45 billion is spent outside the NIH. 11% is for intramural research, so like Dr. Cedar is an intramural researcher, Dr. Bloom is an intramural researcher at the NIH, and you heard presentations from them earlier today. So some of the money of this budget is spent towards supporting their labs and staff, but most of the work is done on extramural research. We support over 300,000 scientists and research personnel, 2,500 institutions, and we support over 50,000 competitive grants. So as I mentioned before, there's the intramural part that we heard several of speakers earlier today speak from. And we also have the extramural research division. The 3 divisions at NIAID are the Division of Microbiology and Infectious Diseases. Drs. McGugan and Hall work there at DMID. The Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Transplantation, and the Division of AIDS. And program officers will work in each of these 3 divisions at NIAID. In the division of extramural activities, people like me, scientific review officers, manage the review of applications. And just in our group, we have about 50 scientific review officers at NIAID managing the review of applications submitted to our center. So a little bit about NIH and foreign investments. So how does the NIH invest globally? We provide direct foreign grants. That's a grant directly to an international institution. We also provide funding via domestic grants with a foreign component. So say you collaborate with an investigator in the United States, but they need your expertise or your clinical site. You are considered a foreign component of a grant that's a domestic grant that has a foreign component. We also have some indirect investments where there are collaborations with extramural and NIH researchers. And we conduct research in over 160, and support research in over 160 countries. So specifically about investment in Brazil, the overall budget for international funding in FY22 from NIAID was $667 million. In the Americas, about $144 million was spent. In Brazil specifically, NIAID spent over $33 million. And so NIH funded over 250 projects in FY22. 22 different institutes are involved with Brazil, and Brazil is the largest portfolio in Latin America for the NIH. Particularly, NIAID has the biggest portfolio and has collaborated over more than 45 years with people in Brazil. This is just listing also the top organizations that we conduct research in. So very briefly, if you look at in Latin America, look at all of the Latin America countries, Brazil ranks the top in terms of funding by extramural funding, in terms of conducting clinical trials, as well as intramural awards. So Brazil is a very important collaborator for us, and we support research in Brazil as well. So now I'm going to hand over the presentation for a little bit of time to Dr. McGugan. who will talk about the grant process, and then he will return it back to me in a few minutes. So Glenn.
All right. So yes, thanks so much, Anuja. So yeah, if you've never navigated the NIH process before, this may be familiar to you. You may be lost. You may feel confused. So I hope over the next few slides to demystify the process for you just a little bit. So next slide. So if you're familiar with the NIH at all, you probably know that getting funding for your projects requires submission of some sort of grant to the NIH. And on the other side, you will get money for that research, or you may have to try again. But it's what happens in this middle, this black box with the question marks, that a lot of people are unsure about. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about the overview of the NIH grants process, which begins on that top line there with you planning an application, finding a funding opportunity, and then writing the application. Now, this portion is going to be completely dependent on you in terms of timing, how long it takes you to plan the application, how long it takes you to actually write the application. But eventually, you're going to submit it to the NIH, and all application submissions are now electronic through places like grants.gov. Once it comes here to the NIH, it's going to go through a peer review process. And I think Anuja is going to talk much more details about this, but it'll be assigned to a specific review group where the NIH calls in scientists that are in your field of expertise to be able to review those applications for us. And then those applications are taken to an advisory council. For each institute, they have their own advisory council about 3 times per year, and then a decision to fund is made. And hopefully, at the end, you'll get a notice of award so that the funds can be transferred to your account to do the research. Now, from the time you submit the application until the time you receive those funds could be as much as 9 months, maybe more, and that's if you're lucky on the first try. But as many of you may know, you may have to resubmit that application. And so the point here is to be patient and plan early for these applications. Next slide. So in developing your research idea, you want to think about at least 3 things. And the first is you want to find an idea that's competitive and that's important for your field of research. Secondly, it needs to align with the mission of NIH and one of those 27 institutes that we mentioned earlier. And it needs to be unique. So that is, it's not already funded by the NIH. And so you may be asking, how do you know if it is in the mission, or how do you know if it's already funded? Next slide. So the NIH has a site known as the NIH Reporter, and this is the Research Portfolio Online Reporting Tool. And so I encourage you to make use of this site. You can find out how many awards the NIH has made to Brazil, for example, and what types of applications, what the topics were. But you can find what the NIH is funding in specific areas by looking here. Next slide. So as Anuja mentioned earlier, the NIH is not just one institute, but it's rather 27 different institutes and centers. And each of those institutes and centers has their own mission. They have different grant programs, and they all have eligibility differences. And so even though Anuja and I and Lee work for NIAID, we know the most about NIAID, your research may be applicable to more than one of these institutes. So it's important to look at all of the institutes at the NIH where your research may be conducted. Okay, next slide. And next slide. So developing your research idea by using this NIH Reporter, you can get an overview of previously or similarly funded projects. And by doing this, you can identify underrepresented or even overrepresented areas of research. Maybe you want to identify experts that are in the field. You can look at their publications, the grants that they've been funded for, and even the review groups that have reviewed their applications. And using this tool, this will help you identify the most appropriate institute at the NIH for your project, and even the most appropriate program officer, people like me. Next slide. So navigating the process can be a little confusing, but fortunately there are a number of people on this side who are here to help you. And there are program staff, people like me. There are scientific review officers, people like Anuja. And then we also have grants management specialists and officers. So Anuja will talk to you more about the SRO role, but in terms of the program officer, we oversee a portfolio of grants and contracts for our particular institute in a particular subject area. We monitor the progress of the research, identify priorities, gaps, and opportunities, and then advocate for the best science. Next slide. So when you contact a program officer, there are a number of things that you may want to ask them. For example, is your project a good fit for the institute where they're working? Maybe you need help identifying a funding opportunity, so you can ask that of a program officer. Maybe you don't know what type of grant that you need to apply for based on the stage of your career. After the review, you may want to discuss that review of your applications. And then importantly, what are your chances of being funded? Next slide. So contacting a PO, first you want to find the most appropriate program officer. And one straightforward way to do that is to look at the funding opportunity itself. And by doing that, there will be a name that's associated that will be the scientific contact. But if you have no idea which funding opportunity might be appropriate for you, you can also use that tool that I mentioned earlier, the reporter tool. And there's a subset of that called Matchmaker. And so what you do is put in your abstract, your specific aims, and it'll give you a hit list of the most appropriate program staff. So what I would suggest to do is provide a brief summary of your project. I call it like a concept paper, and email that to the program officer and set up a time for a meeting. So I'm often asked, what about cold calling? Our phone numbers are available on the web. Can you just call us? Of course, you can call us anytime. But in my experience, the conversation is much more fruitful if you first email us. So that gives us time to research your topic, look for funding opportunities, or maybe we're not even the most appropriate person, so we can put you in contact with that person. So when I first started at the NIH many years ago, a lot of people were nervous. I found out, new investigators especially, about contacting a program officer for the first time. Next slide. But I can tell you that it is one of the most rewarding and important parts of our job. So I encourage you to reach out to program staff, get to know us, and we can help you navigate the system. Next slide. Just a few more details about what I mean by a concept paper. This doesn't need to be anything very formal, just the study goals, maybe your abstract, your aims, study design. And if you know the funding opportunity that you're looking for, you can include that as well. And again, email, and we can set up a time to chat about your project. Next slide. So let's talk just a minute about eligibility. And so the first thing to note is that grant awards that are issued by the NIH are actually, by and large, to institutions rather than people. Okay? So because of that, I encourage investigators to have a communication with their organization's representative. Now, depending on your organization, this may be called your signing official or your authorized representative. They're often in your business office or your office of sponsored programs, something like that, because they're going to submit that application on your behalf. And then all the applications have to respond to a Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, N-O-F-O. And in that NOFO, you'll find out eligibility information as well as contact information. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about how you find those NOFOs. How do you find those funding opportunities? Next slide. And I just want to pose a brief question to you. I can't see anybody in the audience, so you can just answer for you. Okay. So most NIH funding opportunity announcements are only open to US-based or domestic institutions. Do you think that's true or false? So raise your hand if you think it's true, and Anuja can look.
Oh, nobody's raised their hand.
Good, good. So that is in fact false, right? So in fact, the majority of the funding opportunities from the NIH are actually opened pretty broadly, including non-domestic institutions. Next slide. So foreign organizations, as Anuja mentioned earlier, can receive funding from the NIH in two basic ways. The first is direct foreign awards, and the second is domestic awards with a foreign component. And each of these have some distinction. Next slide. So the direct award allows you the full budget for whatever you ask for. That's what will come back for you to do your research. But the trade-off is there are some additional review criteria, and it requires special approval by our advisory council. The foreign component route means that, as Anuja mentioned earlier, that the institution in the US, for example, partners with you, so they collaborate with you, and a portion of the funds will go to your institution. So it's sometimes an easier route, but it has a standard review criteria. Next slide. So what I generally advise is to let the science dictate which of these is the most appropriate. And if you aren't sure, you can always reach out to program staff such as myself, and we can help you navigate that. Next slide. So for those direct awards, you will have the standard review criteria that we'll go more into if you have questions about them. Next slide. But you will have these additional review criteria as well that will be posed to the reviewers. So they're looking for unusual talents, unusual resources or populations, or maybe environmental conditions. So for example, let's say that you have access to a patient population in Brazil where it's not duplicated in the US. So those are all reasons why this award needs to be a direct to foreign award. Second is the same work being done in the US, right? So that's something that you need to consider. And is the research relevant to the mission of the NIH as a whole and also to the institute where you're applying this? Next slide. So funding opportunities from the NIH can be grouped into these three buckets, really. So we have grants, we have cooperative agreements, and we have contracts. Most people here are probably most interested in the grants. And so under the grants, we have investigator-initiated applications. That's where you have an idea and you submit that idea to the NIH. We also have program announcements and requests for applications. And those are where the NIH has identified certain areas where we want to solicit applications, and we even set aside funds for some of those. Cooperative agreements are very similar to grants, except program staff have much more involvement in that. And then finally, contracts. Next slide. So the NIH has a number of grant activity codes or grant types. Now I won't present them all, but these are 4 of the most common that you may be interested in. The first, if you know anything about the NIH, you've probably heard of the Research Project Grant, or the R01. And these are used to support these specific research projects, usually hypothesis-driven, mechanistic, lots of preliminary data. These are 5-year, they're renewable. We also have smaller grant programs like the exploratory R21 and the small grant R03. So the R21, these are new exploratory type projects. Preliminary data are usually not required, but they're not renewable. Same thing with the small grant R03. These support like pilot feasibility studies, things like that. And then finally the U01, these again, they're similar to the R01, except there's much more programmatic involvement in those. Next slide. Wanted to make note that NIAID and the NIH does support clinical trials, and the definition of an NIH-defined clinical trial is in the box at the top of the slide. I won't belabor the point here, but if you have questions, you're welcome to ask those. I just wanted you to be aware that we do support clinical trials, and including clinical trials that are direct foreign awards as well. Next slide. So let's take a look finally at the NIH grant and funding website. And so this would be at grants.nih.gov. And so when you go to this site, next slide, you will find a page that looks something like this. Now don't be surprised when you look if it's a little different. They change this from time to time. But somewhere on the page, next slide, you will see what you see in the center here, so finding funding opportunities. And when you click that link, next slide, you will be taken to the NIH guide for grants and contracts. And using this site, you can search using keywords. You can limit it by organization or funding category. So for example, I just typed in climate change, since that's the focus of this particular workshop, to see what would come up. So next slide. So when I typed in the keyword climate change, I received a few of these hits. And you'll notice the title is listed here, the notice number, which organization is issuing this, and then importantly, the expiration date and activity codes for this. So let's say one of these looks interesting to you. You can click on the hyperlink for the notice number. Next slide. And that'll take you to the actual notice of funding opportunity. Now, for sake of time, I won't go through every element on this, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. But they're roughly divided into two parts. Part one is the overview, and this is where you can go and skim just to see under the purpose if your research fits with this particular funding opportunity. Next slide. It's also where you can see the dates. So when is the application due date? When is it going to be reviewed? To make sure that it fits with this schedule of when you're planning to do. Now you'll notice under the part 2, there's the full text, and that's where you can go for the meat and figure out more information about this particular project. And specifically section 3, next slide, under eligibility. So this is where you want to look to see if non-US based institutions are eligible to apply. And you'll notice for this example, foreign institutions, it says non-domestic entities are eligible to apply. So Brazil, your organization in Brazil, would be able to apply for this funding opportunity. Next slide. And finally, funding for international investigators. You should also check out Fogarty International Center. And so they produce a funding newsletter that you can, they update it every week. And so their communications office, you can sign up for updates here. You can also do this from the NIH Guide to Grants and Contracts. So you can find that a weekly email. You can also get this on the social media pages as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Anuja.
Thanks, Glenn. So all of the links are on the PDF, so you don't have to take pictures of them. You can just take a copy and you'll get to the links that Glenn was talking about. So I just want to spend a little time talking about what happens after you decide to write this application. It takes a long time. You've talked to your colleagues, you've put together a proposal, you've talked to your authorized organization, and you're ready to submit that grant. You're really exhausted. You submit an application to a specific notice of funding opportunity. What happens? So all of the applications go to the Division of Receipt and Referral at the Center of Scientific Review. So every application goes there. And there at the Division of Receipt and Referral, they decide whether a specific institute is going to review your grant or whether the Center of Scientific Review will review your grant. So the typical R01, R21, and R03s are generally reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. They do the majority of the review at the NIH, and I think they have over 250 scientific review officers performing the task. But say, for example, this is a notice of funding opportunity specific to NIAID, then it would come to a specific study section, so it would come to our group, and our group will decide how to do the review. So as I mentioned, the typical R01s, R21s go to CSR, but sometimes the more complicated grants, so program project grants known as PO1s, or larger U19 grants that are specific to NIAID will come to our branch for review. So what does someone like me do? So I'm a scientific review officer, and the major task or the goal for a scientific review officer is to ensure that the peer review process is fair, unbiased, and objective. So there's a little bit of a distinction, a fair bit of distinction between a program officer and a scientific review officer. So Glenn, for example, is in the parasitology branch, so obviously he is biased and he would want all investigators involved with working with parasites to be funded. So he has a vested interest in guiding people who are interested in a specific area of research. But it all comes to me, but my job then is to make sure that every application that comes in response to a NOFO gets a fair, unbiased, and objective review. So once we get a certain number of applications, so it might be 5, it might be 10, it might be 100, we don't know that. So once we get that, my job is to analyze the content of each application and then try to decide what are the main areas of expertise that I need to get reviewers to review that application. So when it's 100 applications, you can imagine it's quite a long, difficult task, and we have to gather together reviewers. Typically, reviewers are from academic institutions, quite commonly in the United States, but we also have reviewers from other countries. So if you are interested in reviewing for the NIH, please feel free to reach out to me as well. So I analyze the content of each application, and then I recruit qualified reviewers who are not conflicted. So very commonly, we have to identify who is not conflicted. So for example, we don't want a reviewer who's a direct competition to that application, right? So they may be biased and say, oh, this application doesn't work well because of X, Y, Z reason, but they may be biased because they don't want you to be funded. So my job is to make sure that the people who are recruited to that panel are fair and don't have a conflict, and there can be an actual conflict and there can be an appearance of a conflict. So these are very difficult decisions for us to make, but we spend a lot of time trying to identify reviewers who are not conflicted. We also oversee the administrative and regulatory aspects of the review. So once we get the qualified reviewers, we will determine who will be reviewers for your application, and then reviewers are given about a month to review your application. So we give them X number of applications, reviewers go through the applications, there are specific review criteria for each notice of funding opportunity, so they will evaluate your application based on the funding criteria, okay. And the last thing we do is oversee the regulatory aspects of the peer review panel. So we gather together this peer review panel of reviewers, and they will discuss all of the applications under review. So the reviewers, once they're assigned to your application, they prepare critiques. So some of the critiques, if they're for a smaller notice of funding opportunity, can be small, but many times they're based on a certain scored review criteria. So reviewers prepare critiques, and they are prepared also to lead the discussion at the meeting. They generate a preliminary score, and then they submit critiques. And so for example, if there are 100 applications, we know also how many applications the NIH or NIAID can fund. If we can only fund 5 applications, we cannot review each of the 100 applications at the meeting. So we come to a decision about the panel, the review panel comes to a discussion of how many of these applications will actually be discussed at the review meeting. So we might only discuss 50% of the applications. So if there are 25 applications at the review meeting, we will probably discuss only 12 or 13 applications. It very much depends on how much funding there is available and how many applications are being reviewed. So that's known as streamlining. But all of the applications that are submitted will get a summary statement with evaluations. So this is what a typical in-person meeting looks like. People are with their computers and their evaluations. They sit around a large table, and the meetings typically last for 1 to 2 days. Reviewers are people like you, academic investigators. For contracts, quite often we have people from industry, maybe small businesses, people who work there. And the assigned reviewers present their evaluations. And after a general discussions, all of the reviewers will privately score the overall impact score of each application. Relevant program staff are encouraged to attend the meeting, and the results are released to the applicant. So what does it mean that you get an overall impact score? So this is defined differently for different types of applications. So a score of 1 is considered very high, overall impact very high, and a score of 9 is considered an overall impact that's relatively low. And for an R01, which is a research project grant application, it's the likelihood for the project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on the research field. So there are certain evaluation criteria. I think Glenn had mentioned them. So significance of the application, the investigator, the innovation of the proposal, the approach taken, and the environment. So I won't read through everything, but as an example, under significance, does the project that you submit address an important problem or a critical barrier to progress in the field? And if the aims are achieved, so you have specific aims that are listed, if the aims are achieved, How will science be improved in the area? So these are scored evaluation criteria, and the reviewers take these very carefully when they evaluate your application. So I just wanted to mention that these scored review criteria are changing. From January 2025, there will be 3 criteria rather than the 5 standard criteria. The 5 standard criteria are significance, investigator, innovation approach, and environment. For applications submitted after January 2025, Factor 1 will combine significance and innovation, and that's a scored review criteria. Factor 2 is on rigor and reproducibility, and that will include the approach. And Factor 3, so the Factor 2 will get a score, and Factor 3, which is expertise and resources, that includes the investigators and the environment, that will not receive a score. There will not be an overall individual score for the expertise and resources. So please stay tuned. If you're thinking of submitting an application next year, the review criteria will be changed, and there's a link for the simplified review criteria as well in our PDF. So what do you do? So you submitted your application, it's gone through peer review, the scores have been released, and now you receive this large PDF with a lot of evaluations. What do you really do? So that's called the summary statement. The summary statement basically is the evaluation that each of the reviewers put in specifically, and also the scientific review officer then puts together a discussion or a resume of what happened actually during the discussion. Maybe at the discussion there was more, something else came out that was not in the evaluation. So it's my job to summarize what actually happened at the review meeting in the resume section. That you'll see at the beginning part of your summary statement. So don't be discouraged if you don't get funded the first time. We certainly ask you to discuss with your colleagues and mentors about the summary statement. Once you've had a chance to think about the summary statement, then please reach out to your program officers, or somebody like Glenn will help you work through the critiques. And someone like Glenn would say, oh, these are the critiques, maybe you should try to address them before you try to resubmit the application. And then please resubmit your application carefully and thinking and addressing the reviewer's critiques. So quite often what happens is if you don't address the reviewer's critiques and you just submit an application again, you probably are not going to get a better score than you did the first time. So that can be quite a challenge. All right. So how are funding decisions made? So say you have a good score, but you don't know right away whether you're going to be funded or not. So there are many things that impact whether you can get funded or not. So the impact score, which is what I just talked about, certainly is important in and will be used in funding decisions. The summary statement is also very important because that gives an opportunity for the program officers and the advisory council to read through the comments and see what are the main criticisms and try to decide whether that helps with determining funding. There's also programmatic factors that come into funding decisions. So it has to be relevant to the institute's mission. As Glenn said, we have 27 different institutes. Each institute has its own mission. So if your application has a good score, but it's not as relevant to that funding institute, you may or may not get funded. So you have to think about that as well. And also, whether you're a new investigator or not. So if you're a new investigator, you get a little bit of a bonus because people understand how difficult it is for you to submit an application. And finally, of course, the availability of funds. As I said, for each program, there might be a specific set-aside funds. So if they can only fund 3 applications, then they have to decide. Say there were 100 applications were submitted, 25 were discussed, and they can only fund 3. So they have to decide which of these 3 they are going to fund. And based on all of these criteria, funding decisions are made. And finally, if you are successful and get an application funded, you will receive a notice of award. And the notice of award will be to your institute, and it will be worked through the grants management officer. So a grants management specialist will implement the funding process, will monitor the budget, and ensure compliance with the institute policies and regulations. So each institute will have different procedures for going through this step. And the final funding decisions are based on advice from program staff and the advisory council board. So just a few take-home messages. Become familiar with the missions, the program and funding opportunities of the NIH institutes and centers. Learn where to look for funding opportunities. Glenn talked about them. Please make sure to contact the NIH staff. Read the Notice of Funding Opportunity carefully. It's sometimes a very large document. Take the time to read through the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Please don't be afraid to ask your colleagues, especially if you have colleagues who have applied for funding. That's the best way for you to talk about and work through all the criticisms before you decide to submit an application. Be persistent and be patient. Most of the applications submitted to the NIH do not get funded right away. So that's certainly a take-home message. So I do want to thank a few people. The organizers for this meeting, allowing us the opportunity to come. Unfortunately, Drs. Hall and McGugan couldn't be here, but I'm sure they wanted to be here. At the Office of Global Research, Lucy Rudderman. At the Fogarty International Center, Kevin Bialy. And at the Immunology Review Branch, or the Scientific Review Program where I work, a number of individuals who made it possible for me to come here. So at this point, I think we are done with the presentation. But maybe if anybody had questions, or let me ask Leonardo, how should we do this? Should we have a couple of people come up, or? Oh, you want to come? Oh, you can just come. Yeah. If anybody has any questions for any of us, please feel free to come up to the mic.
Okay, so thank you for the explanation. Yes. So a quick question, maybe you could comment on that. So there are a few opportunities that actually, like the international institution can directly ask for the R1, for example. But I mean, I found that in those cases, whenever we go and start looking into the criteria or the regulation about concerning animal care or animal ethics, and especially like with clinical human data, things get, I will not say complicated. It does get complicated, but especially it seems that the demands from the NIH not necessarily are the same from Brazil, well, in my case. So I don't know if you can comment on that, or on the importance of addressing specific legislations for NIH, how these things have been handled in the past. Glenn, would you address that?
Sure. Yeah, sure. No, it's a very good point. And I would say that it's not unique to foreign institutions. US-based institutions have to deal with those same regulatory elements, and it's not always easy to navigate. Fortunately, most of those requirements are only come into play if your application is chosen for funding. So for example, IRB approvals or IFF approvals, things like that. And so after you have submitted your application, after it's scored and it may be eligible for funding, the program officer and the grants management specialist can work with you and your institution, as well as our Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare here at the NIH. We can work with your institution to get any of those registrations or approvals that you need for funding. So feel free to reach out and ask those. Even as you're writing the application, we can help you with some of those things that we know up front that are going to be required and help you with that.
I think you have a follow-up question, yeah?
Yeah, so yeah, I noticed that if you go in the manuals, you can always see that some of these requirements you can start filling out after you actually make the first few steps of the applications. So concerning what Glenn was just saying, I was curious about how long would I have before, I mean, the application is withdrawn or something like that to actually meet these requirements and try to fulfill other expectations.
So once an application is submitted and it's passed through the initial stages, it's going to go through review. But it takes some time. It takes 2 or 3 months. You don't have any time at that time to edit or before the review. You don't have any time to edit that review. So, because once you submit, you submit. And then if it gets discussed and if it gets funded, then as Glenn said, then you have the other things of getting, if you're doing human studies, to have IRB approval done at your institute. But even during the submission process, you have to take care of, if you're doing animal studies, do you have appropriate facilities? Because that will come up very strongly in review. If you don't have the right animal facilities, or say you're doing BSL-3 work, but you don't have a BSL-3 lab, it will very strongly be a negative point in the way the reviewers are scoring. So some aspects have to be taken care of before, and they will tell you which is scored. So animal studies, human subject welfare is all scorable during review. So that has to be taken care of. But the approvals for you to do the studies at the institute, or even your IR Cook approval, which is the animal studies, can you do the studies? That's after funding it has been made.
Yeah, okay. So I think what I was trying to ask was, if I get funded,
yes.
How long would I have before actually receiving the grant? I mean, adjust my application to the requirements. Are we talking about like a month, 6 months? I don't know.
Not 6 months, but Glenn would probably be able to tell you.
Yeah, it depends on the timing of the year. So our fiscal year runs from the beginning of September through, the beginning of October through the end of September. And so if we're approaching the end of our fiscal year, the grants management folks try to get the awards out prior to the end of the year. If you're in the first cycle, it could be sooner, it could be later. It all depends on how complicated your application is and, how many approvals you need, things like that. But as Anuja said, it's not usually months or multiple months. We're talking usually weeks from the time that you get a fundable score and you start getting requests from your grants management specialist for updated information, things like that. From that point, you're talking usually a matter of weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I would say most applicants will have that ready ahead of time. If they know they've had a good score, they will have all of that in place. So maybe I'm just going to ask Dr. Lanzaro a question, because he's collaborated with a number of people in Brazil. What advice would you give to international investigators as they prepare applications, and is there any guidance, being a reviewer as well, that would be helpful to applicants from here?
Okay, sorry. Well, let me start by saying that I have been successful with NIH. I had sort of continuous NIH support for about 20 years, which lucky for me. But it's been a while, so and I know things have changed. As far as reviewing goes, and I'm not sure today if you still have panels, like panels that are like sort of longer term.
Right, so that usually happens at the Center for Scientific Review, where people are on standing study section, and they will review. They have 3-year terms, and they review all of the applications that come to a certain institute, come to a certain standing study section. At NIAID, where I work, our reviewers are just ad hoc, so they are recruited every time for new applications.
Okay, great. So I served for 3 years on a review panel, so that's just where I'm coming from. But it has been a while since I've applied for NIH funding. But in general, I would say, in terms of writing a proposal, I think it's important to remember that there's a human being reviewer on the other end, and that reviewer has got a number of proposals to review. So I think it's important to make sure that your application is readable, so that there's a prose and there's something that will keep the reviewer engaged with the proposal. So that's one thing. I think it's important, also helpful from a reviewer's standpoint, is if you organize your application so that the criteria that are being reviewed are clearly organized so that the reviewer has an easy time seeing, are you meeting, are you checking this box, are you checking that box? So that's very important as well, I think. I would also say, and this especially for people who don't have English as a first language, you really need to make sure you go through your application and look for grammatical errors, typographical errors. If a proposal's got too many of those types of errors in them, it undermines the reviewer's confidence in you. So I would say spend the time and make sure that your application is well written. And then I guess the third thing is I always found it helpful, and based on the comments I've gotten back on the ones that I submitted that were successful, is that the graphics can be very, very helpful. So I think illustrating points is also very important. However, the graphics should be clear. A reviewer shouldn't have to struggle through a super complicated graphic. And some of them are complicated just by the very nature of the work, but keep it as simple and as interpretable as you possibly can. So I think those are just some important things that I would suggest in terms of just writing a good proposal. And then finally, if I may, I think when you review the literature, make sure that you're contemporary. So make sure you're not missing a reference or a citation that's an important one for your project, but that may have just come out, you know, a few months ago. So I think that's important as well, making sure that you reinforce your application with citations that are up to date. So those are just some of the suggestions I would have in terms of just writing a good proposal, I think.
Those are really great suggestions, and I can't tell you how many times during review people criticize because the font is too small, reviewers cannot read, so they get very angry because they're like, you're trying to put it, you know, you may have only 12 pages, say, as a limit. Sometimes people put in 15 pages in the 12 pages, so they don't follow the font size, so they will use a font size like 6. Or then the graphics are not legible. So I think it really irritates reviewers because they now have to take the extra time. And also, if you are careless, and sometimes people copy and paste from other grants and put it in, you know, say you're writing a malaria grant, sometimes people will see something on dengue in that application. That makes, you know, that really irritates reviewers. So be very careful and be very critical. I think one other point I will make is you are very passionate about your research and you know the most, but you're trying to explain to other scientists who may not necessarily be in your field why what you're doing is important. So, you know, you may just say something in one sentence because you understand the complexities, but if someone like me is reviewing it, I'm like, what is this person saying? So you have to try to explain carefully why it's important what you're doing, and, you know, and assume that the person across is not necessarily an expert in every specific area that you are in, right? They may be an expert in one field, and that's why they're on the review panel. But they may not know something about the epidemiology, and that's for you to convince them why it's important to do it. So it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time to do it. So, yeah, sorry.
Just a few comments. When I was in the US, I submitted quite a few grant proposals to NIH. For me, it was somehow easy there, because there we had to focus very much on the proposal itself, on the science, because the institute had all the knowledge, administrative knowledge, to fill up all the forms and to know every demand that a grant application requires. And that, I think, it's going to be a great difficulty here, probably that people here in Brazil face, because of course most of the institutions don't have that knowledge. So one thing that I think that institutions that receive a lot more grants, like Fiocruz or University of São Paulo, if they want to have investigators applying for NIH grants, is to get officers trained for the administrative side. And I think that's something very important. And one thing that I participated also in some review panels, and what I can say that usually the 99% of the proposals are very good.
Yes.
So it's really difficult. So every small mistake that you make probably will compromise your application. So,
without a doubt.
yeah, because they are usually very strong applications, all of them, or most of them, and sometimes you have only 5% of them
Yes.
approved. So it's need to be very careful with how you write. I think Greg gave very nice advice about that too. And I have one question. Before, some people here text me asking if the presentation there will be available for the people here. Do you think it's possible?
I can talk to Glenn and we can see. Yeah, I think it should be. Most of the information is public anyway. So.
Right, because it helps a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
especially for those who are not familiar with the process. So if you could make available for us,
Yeah.
it would be great.
I could do that.
My question is, I have a collaboration with Hans, but he's intramural.
Yes.
My question is, if I want to prepare a proposal, collaborating with Hans, who's intramural, what's the mechanism? Is there a different mechanism? Is a normal R01? He can participate in a R01. I don't know how it works when you're trying to collaborate with an intramural NIH researcher.
So I can just give you a couple of minutes and then maybe Glenn can fill in. So an intramural investigator can participate. They cannot receive funds and they cannot receive salary support because their salaries are covered, right? But they have to be doing, maybe they're doing some aspect of some techniques in the U.S. So you can have an intramural investigator, but the main funds will come to you. And you have to very clearly state why you are collaborating with the intramural investigator for submitting a specific application. Glenn, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, yeah. So as Anuja said, no salary support or funds can go to intramural. They can collaborate with you. The other thing to keep in mind is the level or the nature of the collaboration. If they're responsible for a substantial part of the project, they're doing a specific aim or they're very integral to it, the NIH will consider that a cooperative agreement. So it would not be an R01. So it really depends on the level of the involvement of the intramural investigator. If it's just, they're providing samples for you or they're providing like a consultation, stuff like that, then an R01 is usually fine. But if you're curious about that, you can open a dialogue with the intramural investigator and a program person like me, and we'll help you decide whether it's more appropriate as an R01 or U01, things like that.
And a quick question. If you submit extramural from the R01, a common R01, from here, is this types of proposal, they fund infrastructure, like equipment and this kind of thing? They are able to fund that?
Yeah, so the NIH, by and large, we have some of these large infrastructure type grants, but for the standard R01, U01, R21, equipment is allowed. It just has to be justified in your application, so the types of equipment. Now, you wouldn't be able to build a new building or anything like that, but if you need a microscope, you need computers, you need things like that, you can add those as part of your application. And in review, as Anuja mentioned, the reviewers will also look at your budget. It's not a scoreable item, but after the discussion of the science, they will look at your budget. And if you're asking for things, for equipment, for whatever, that's not needed for that particular project, they'll comment on that, and they may reduce the budget accordingly. So make sure it's justified. I guess that's the point.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think also in addition to equipment, in terms of personnel, don't over-assign personnel. You need to know for this project how many, do I need a postdoc? Do I need a postdoc and a student? Don't put 5 postdocs in if you only have work for 1 postdoc, because that will also come up. It's not scoreable, but it's still, it'll come up during the discussion. And it shouldn't impact the score, but the reviewers can suggest a reduction in your budget if you haven't justified it carefully.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I'm Andrea Dyer from Fiocruz. I run clinical trials. And most of the times we have some relationship with the pharmaceuticals. It could be a donation, but it could also be a partnership. How would you face that? What would be the best approach? Having a donation from the medicines or establishing a partnership in order to have in one of those initiative investigators trials?
Glenn, could you answer
Yeah,
that?
sure, sure. So it would depend on you and what your preference is. We have seen both. So there are occasions where the pharmaceutical company may donate the particular medicine that you're using for the clinical trial. It could be a formal partnership if you want to partner with them, either them or a contract research organization, for example, to conduct the trial for you. Any of those things are possible. So, you can always reach out to us and we can help you navigate that as well.
So my question is related to the preliminary data. So how much is requirements for the proposal based on your experience with successful grants?
So I think it depends on the mechanism. So for example, the R21 that Glenn talked about, it's a 2-year grant, $275,000, where they state no preliminary data is required. Having said that, many investigators still submit preliminary data. Reviewers are told not to count that negatively if you haven't included preliminary data. So it's a bit of a judgment, and it's a bit of being savvy on your end how much you're going to include. For something like an R01 or a UO1, it's absolutely required. You have to show why you want to do the studies, the preliminary data supporting what you're trying to propose. But again, it's very much dependent on each mechanism, but it is true though for R21s. Quite often this is what happens when people submit R01s and they don't get funded. They will condense that to an R21 and submit it for the next cycle. If they have received, maybe they received a criticism that it's too risky, whatever they proposed in the R01. That's more a long, stable grant. So then they will revise that grant and submit it as an R21 with a lot of data. So it's not like, so the reviewers will look at that data, and obviously they will be influenced by the amount of data you have. But if you don't have data, they are not supposed to criticize you. But, keep that in mind.
And one more question then. CZI and Gates Foundation, they have a nice portal that shows why they select some proposals. Like say, on one page, this idea was nice because of this and that. NIH has some sorts of portal like this because that inspires people to say, maybe my idea is worth.
Well, the summary statement is a very large portal that gives you a summary of what happened during the discussion. So some of the summary statements that I compiled together are 70 or 80 pages long. They're very long evaluations of what they think the strengths are of your proposal and what they think the weaknesses are of your proposal. And also a summary, like a preliminary summary of what that whole thing...
yeah, but I'm thinking about something public that other people can read about, say like, this proposal got funded because of this and that. So when I write a proposal...
Oh, I see. So on the NIH website, there are examples of summary statements from people who have already been funded. So that's kind of advice, when you're looking, you can go and download those summary statements as an example to prepare, of applications, as an example for you while you prepare your application, because it takes a lot of time to prepare that application. So they give you, actually in some examples of the application, this is a good point. They put this clearly. Here the fonts are good. Here they've summarized their work well. But I think for each funded proposal, there's no clear website where they can, you can say why this particular application got funded. I don't think we have it at the NIH. Do you know otherwise?
Yeah, I would just say that, looking at the other place I advise people to look is the NIH Reporter, as I mentioned earlier. So this is not going to show you the summary statement, but it will show you in your particular area the types of projects that have been funded, and you'll be able to see the abstract, specific aims, things like that. So yeah, we don't have, I know what you're talking about with some of these other foundations going bit by bit for the ones that were funded and not. NIAID, like a lot of institutes, funds also by a pay line, so we publish those. So let's say that, as Anuja mentioned, on your summary statement, you got a score of 23 or 10 or whatever. You'll be able to look at the NIAID website, and it'll say for the R21, if you have a score of 23 or lower, then you're going to get funded. So that's the established pay line. And so, you know, it's a little bit different as opposed to Gates and others that fund just by whatever their priority is at the time.
Courtney.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on the R21 and preliminary data. I serve on study sections, so preliminary data are not required. However, if you provide preliminary data and they are weak, it could hurt you because reviewers can then judge you based on the preliminary data you provide. So if you are going to provide preliminary data, it should always be strong and should kind of strengthen the argument for, you know, why the aim that you're proposing is significant, innovative, et cetera. My question, this might not be appropriate necessarily for this, but it's kind of after the grant has been awarded, especially for international projects, there's been some new requirements that have come out recently about having to have access to our international collaborators' raw data, data notebooks, et cetera, for our annual reports. That has been very interesting to navigate because some countries are very protectionist about the raw data. And we have memorandums of understanding that, you know, once the data are published, then they need to be, you know, publicly available. They're okay with that, but they start getting really twitchy about us having access to raw data for potential audits that might come in the future. I know that these aren't going to be provided, and NIH just wants to have access to them. But do you have any recommendations for how to navigate that?
Yeah, it's been a learning curve for all of us, to be honest with you, whenever this was implemented. What I can tell you from the NIH standpoint is that when you're negotiating with a foreign institution to be part of your particular project, the NIH does not need to directly see that raw data. There just has to be a memorandum of understanding, like you said, giving you access to any of the information. So, for example, as the prime institution, if the NIH has questions, they're going to come to you because you're the one who is receiving the funds from the NIH and you're distributing those funds to another institution, for example, a foreign institution. And so if there are questions about the research that's being conducted, your institution is going to be held responsible for that. So your institution needs to make sure that you have access to any data, any information that you need in case there are questions. So that's kind of the relationship between you and this other institution that you have to negotiate.
Okay. Yeah, that seems a bit more reasonable than having to have like a folder with all the raw data that you then upload somewhere. And so, I mean, I haven't crossed that bridge yet. There wasn't anything on the annual review this year that required that. So, but I just figured I'd ask.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's a great question.
If there are no questions, I think, did Lee get dropped off the call? I can only see Glenn now.
No, he's here. Lee's here.
I would just like to have Lee just give us some closing comments. Thank you all for attending. I know it's the last session of a long symposium, but if Lee could just finish up, that would be very great. And thank you all very much for attending this grant writing workshop.
I'm here still, so.
Oh, great.
Can you hear me? Okay,
yes.
Good. All right. Well, you know, I just want to reiterate that I really regret not being able to be there in person. I have to say that the agenda that I saw for the workshop looked fabulous, and I want to particularly thank Glenn and Anuja for putting together this workshop. I think it's been really, they've gone through a wonderful presentation outlining what it takes to get NIH funding and going through some of the challenges. I also want to thank the audience for the questions, which help us to better understand and serve you all as we are trying to move forward. I should also emphasize something that was said early on, which I think is implicit in the fact that we're holding this workshop, and that's that we do fund a tremendous amount of international research. I think it's absolutely critical, particularly for the our mission. We work on, at NIAID, we work on allergic and infectious diseases. And I think, as everyone knows, infectious diseases have no borders. They will be transported around the world easily, and we see that happening time and time again. In addition to which, there is a real need to be looking at diseases outside of our borders and thinking about what we can do to improve our understanding of those diseases and how they are affecting humanity. I think that, again, we do support rigorous research. And with respect to the question about some of the sharing the reasons why certain grants were not funded, I would also point out that much of the data that is included in an application is actually confidential, and you know, we would not want to make a mistake of sharing confidential data inadvertently, particularly since people may want to resubmit. But we are happy to, and I know that program officers like Glenn and others are willing to discuss summary statements and talk about what were the points that went in favor and what were the points that went against, or were the weaknesses that were perceived with respect to an application. So I think this has been a really great overview of the funding process. Since this workshop was really focused on climate and health, I feel that I should also say something about climate and health and NIAID's interest in this area. Just by way of disclaimer, I actually serve on the steering committee for the NIH-wide Climate Change and Health Initiative. And so I've been quite extensively involved in thinking about some of these issues. And my understanding is that the websites for the NIH-wide Climate Change and Health Initiative have been provided to you all. And I would strongly encourage you to be looking at those as you are thinking about applications that might be addressing these issues related to climate change and health. Just to reiterate perhaps what Dr. Marazzo said, and again, the driving force for some of this discussion over the past couple of days. What is the NIH Climate Change and Health Initiative? It is an urgent cross-cutting NIH effort. It covers virtually all of the institutes at this point. The idea here is to stimulate research to reduce health threats from climate change and build health resilience. And the reason that NIH is so interested in this is because we have such a broad scientific expertise relevant to this. And I would point out that NIAID was actually the second largest funder of climate change-related health, climate change and health-related research at the NIH. Only NIEHS had more funding allocated to that. The initiative itself is built around 4 pillars: health effects research, health equity, training and capacity building, and intervention science. It really does encourage a transdisciplinary approach, and there are efforts underway to build out a transdisciplinary community of practice. Having said that, there are numerous cogs that span the full spectrum from basic and mechanistic research all the way through field and clinical and even interactions with the ecological aspects. And again, it's all outlined on the website for the NIH Climate Change and Health Initiative. So I would there are also, on that website, there are also funding opportunities. The way that the NIH-wide Climate Change and Health Initiative is operating is to put out these various announcements that are to encourage research in this area. When the funding comes in, there is actually allocated funding that is set aside for climate change and health-related research. The applications that are submitted in response to these requests actually end up being assigned to the various institutes depending on the topics that they address. And then if they receive a fundable score, the funds are transferred from this central pool to the institute. So it's a little bit, it's meant to encourage more research in this area. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of interest in this. So I don't really have a lot more to say. I think that this has been a really wonderful symposium. I will say that there are a lot of research areas, particularly in climate change and health, that need to be addressed. And I would encourage you all to look at that. And I hope that some of Anuja's and Glenn's comments today have shed some light on how to apply for NIH funding and NIAID funding. And I know that having listened to them, it certainly makes the process a little bit clearer. Actually, more than a little bit clearer, much clearer. So thanks to my colleagues, thanks to all of you for attending and participating. Important thing to remember here is that when you are thinking about research, the program officer is your friend. And feel free to reach out to them. And with that, thank you very much. And that's it. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody doesn't believe me or has any further questions.
So thank you very much, both Glenn and Lee, and sad you were not here in Berlin, which is a wonderful city. Thank you again to all the organizers, and any questions, I'm happy to take them after the talk, but feel free to take a PDF and I'll let you know about the presentation to send to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Muito obrigado a todos.